for coming. I realized that Thanksgiving is around the corner and people are getting ready to celebrate, which makes me even more appreciative of your presence here today. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to say a few words about my larger project, my book project. Lydia already mentioned the title. The book is still tentatively titled Communism-the Ice Hotel, the post-1989 Polish initiation novel, and it focuses on the coming-of-age novels of a group of young Polish writers in their 30s and 40s who belong to Poland's last communist generation. I myself belong to that generation, and for me this project is very personal. Even though I grew up in a different communist country, in Bulgaria, I found myself relating to the traumatic maturation experiences of the characters in the novels I examine in my book. And I find the fact that I began the project in 2006 when I joined the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures symptomatic, because living and working in a foreign country, in a foreign culture, make the question who I am even more pressing. I'm convinced that my peers back in Bulgaria are asking themselves this question all the time, but I think it's really important to have a sense of identity if one lives in a foreign culture, foreign country, and functions in a foreign culture. And now, my talk is entitled Poland's Last Communist Generation, Lost or Found in the Transition, and I'll attempt to give answers to this question. The parallel courses of civil and literary history often overlap when major historical cataclysms rupture the peaceful evolution of humanity. However, such overlaps have been known to produce some of the most vigorous periodization debates among literary historians, reflecting literature's constant oscillation between self-referential autonomy and social and political reflection and engagement. The fall of communism in Poland in 1989 was one of those cataclysmic disruptions of the historical flow that has aroused a long-lasting controversy in the literary circles. For the last 20 years, Polish cultural historians and literary critics have been inconclusively debating the issue of whether the politically transformative 1989 should be legitimized as a turning point in Polish literary history. Literary historian Anna Nasiłowska argues that while it is indisputable that 1989 brought fundamental changes to the political life of Poland, it remains unclear whether the changes in the literary domain are distinctive enough to constitute a novel paradigm. She sees the seeds of thematic and aesthetic novelty as early as the second half of the 1970s, when the actual transformation of the political system in Poland began. Nasiłowska points out that one of the reasons for the massive acceptance of the 1989 caesura is the Poles' embarrassment at having to admit that their post-collapse literature has roots in the People's Republic of Poland. Włodzimierz Bolecki also notes that in contrast to 1989, 1945, 1956, and 68, 1989 doesn't relate directly to significant literary events, but is commonly perceived as a historical literary caesura because the socio-political changes it precipitated drastically altered the environment of literary communication. Przemysław Czapliński and Piotr Śliwiński, their literary critics, argue in the same vein that the literary process is neither strictly determined by nor absolutely independent of the political, economic, and spiritual life of a nation. In this sense, a change in literary paradigms is not a mere consequence of a political revolution, but its equivalent in the cultural sphere, one that is equally motivated by and motivational for the political realm. Despite its questionable status as a periodization marker, the year 1989 brought fundamental changes to the Polish literary landscape. It lifted censorship, discontinued state subsidies, established a free book market, and dismissed the imperative of political engagement and patriotic service. In 1992, the distinguished scholar of Polish Romanticism, Maria Janion, announced the demise of the Romantic paradigm that had been defining Polish culture for more than 150 years. The abandonment of Poland's grand narrative meant, among other things, the discontinuation of literature's function as a setter of moral norms and behavioral models. Janion pointed out that unlike the earlier 1918 overthrow of the Romantic paradigm, the post-1989 radical departure was not accompanied by an acquisition of alternative communal ethical prescriptions. The sudden disappearance of all previous facilitators of national, political, social, and religious identification created an unprecedented authority crisis in Polish society. This simultaneously liberating and frightening ethical vacuum gave impetus to a massive and multidirectional quest for self-identity. As Sheila Fitzpatrick aptly notes, successful revolutions tear off masks. That is, they invalidate the conventions of self-presentation and social interaction that obtained in pre-revolutionary society. In such upheavals, people have to reinvent themselves, to create or find within themselves persona that fit the new post-revolutionary society. The process of reinvention is at once a process of reconfiguration, a new arrangement of data about oneself, and one of discovery, a new interpretation of their significance. It always involves strategic decisions. How should I present myself in this new world? And may also prompt ontological reflection. Who am I really? The Polish artistic elite naturally took the lead in the collective archaeology of memory in search of self-defining formative experiences. Czaplinski and Śliwiński observed that the drastically altered socio-political context paradoxically equalized the chances of older and younger generation of Polish writers. It forced the older writers to reinvent themselves and the debutantes to define their artistic profiles. Both generations reached out to the genre of the initiation novel to stage the birth or rebirth of their post-collapse personal and artistic identities. In his insightful examination of the reasons for the massive influx of initiation novels into the post-1989 Polish literary arena, Czaplinski argues that transitional periods in literary history favor the genre of the initiation novel for its effectiveness in abolishing existing hierarchies and in rearranging the ethical and aesthetic priorities of the new paradigm. This popular literary convention, claims Czaplinski, allows writers to deconstruct previous conceptualizations of history and articulate their own insights into the socio-political process in the form of naive revelations. More specifically, the initiation novel offers an opportunity to take a fresh look at the socio-political reality through the reenactment of the universal process of biological and social maturation. The trivialization of this formative experience creates an instantaneous bond between writer and reader, especially the one who recognizes their authenticity, and facilitates the grasp of the new ethical paradigm by the latter. Thus, the initiation novel, among other functions, becomes a vehicle for shaping generational self-awareness and for locating a particular generation in the historical process. Molly Andrews echoes this insight by pointing out that we become who we are through telling stories about our lives and living the stories we tell. Our stories are a cornerstone of our identity. Narratives both construct and are constructed by individuals, but they are encased in larger ideological meta-narratives. Thus, as individuals construct the stories they tell about their lives, they do so as, but not necessarily for, members of a particular generation. Underlying Andrews' concept of a larger ideological meta-narrative is the problem of generational consciousness, which is a crucial factor in the formation of generations. Sociologists Richard Braungart and Margaret Braungart posit that a demographic cohort becomes transformed into a generation only when many of its members become aware that they are bound together by a shared group consciousness, and mobilize as an active force for political change. Karl Mannheim, the author of the pioneering study The Problem of Generations, distinguishes between the notions of generation as location and generation as actuality. He argues that in order to share the same generation location, one must be born within the same historical and cultural unit, which is similar to the concept of a demographic cohort. Generation as actuality, on the other hand, involves a creation of a concrete bond between members of a generation by their being exposed to the social and intellectual symptoms of a process of dynamic destabilization. One can infer then from the preceding definitions that only a cohort exposure to or participation in socio-political upheaval can produce a strong sense of generational belonging among its members and thus activate that generation's inherent potentiality of becoming an engine of social change. Polish philosopher Jan Garewicz observes that generational membership is not a matter of personal choice. Not everyone belongs to a generation, but of historical chance. He describes the generation-defining event as a turning point, a foretaste of the end of the world in the lives of the members of an age group that could not be erased from their memory and could not be surmounted by other subsequent events with similar or even greater magnitudes. It is like an initiation. One could lose his or her innocence only once, however not on a personal but on a communal level. Garewicz also brings up age by reaffirming the romantic idea that a generation-constituting event is experienced only by age groups especially sensitive to sociopolitical cataclysms. This is the period between 16 and 25 years. None of the above quoted theoreticians of the concept of generation, however, elaborates on how exactly the common experience of sociopolitical upheaval translates into generational self-awareness. I conclude this brief theoretical digression by again evoking Molly Andrews, who suggests that it is through acts of narration that the sense of generational distinctiveness is cultivated. By participating in and attending to the stories of our own generation and those of others, we develop a consciousness of ourselves as a constituting distinct group, which in turn contributes to our becoming knowing actors in a historical drama we script. My book project examines a selection of post-1989 initiation novels written by young Polish writers in their 30s and 40s. What unites these works is their treatment of coming of age in late communist Poland from a dual vantage point. That of a young adult coping with the challenges of political transition, and of a child growing up in the last 2 decades of communism. All these novels fulfill a therapeutic purpose. They are an attempt on the part of ontologically confused authors to come to grips with their identity in a chaotic and uncertain post-collapse reality. This quest naturally leads them to the time of their childhood and adolescence when their identities were forged. Taken together, these novels represent a generation-defining project. By depicting the unique formative experiences of Poland's last communist generation, the authors of the post-1989 quasi-autobiographical narratives attempt, with different degrees of intentional explicitness, to assert their own generation's distinctiveness and secure its location in the historical process as an agent of a cultural shift. What is the significance of this generation and why is it important to study it? For the last 20 years, scholarship on Central Eastern Europe has been focused primarily on the political and socio-economic dimensions of the transformation. Substantially less has been written on the cultural and psychological consequences of the changes. The West encouraged a rapid and thorough demolition of the communist system to prevent its eventual resurrection, but it didn't take into consideration the effects of the cataclysmic changes on the everyday life and the psyches of the citizens of former communist countries, especially on young people coming of age during the initial transformative years. They represent a unique generation, the Omega Alpha generation, to use Van Hoorn's label, the last adolescents of the communist system and the first adults of the emerging democracy. They were brought up to survive the oppressive regime, but were bestowed upon the historical chance to build up the democratic foundations of free Poland without pre-existing models or competent experts to provide counsel. The overlap of the political cataclysm with equally profound transformation within these young people's personal lives, their transformation from adolescence to adulthood, is what makes this generation an appealing and necessary subject of scholarly interest. Stroud et al. Point out that when examining the consequences of sociocultural change on individual development, it is important to consider not only the occurrence of such events, but also their timing within an individual's lifespan. Because identity formation is a salient developmental task in late adolescence, historical events that occur during this time in the lifespan are thought to have profound and long-lasting influences. Studying this generation will shed light on two important aspects of the political transformation: its direction and its effectiveness. Young people are very sensitive to changes, and their reactions to them can be indicative of the trajectory of the democratic process. Also, the participatory nature of democracy means that young democratic states depend upon this generation's acquisition and implementation of principles and values of the democratic tradition. Who constitutes the last communist generation in Poland? It is more or less generally accepted that Poland's last communist generation encompasses members of the demographic cohort born in the second half of the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s, and whose childhood and adolescence coincided with the last 2 decades of communism in Poland. The historical event that constituted them as a generation was the prolonged democratic revolution that began in 1981 with the imposition of martial law by General Wojciech Jaruzelski, and concluded with the peaceful collapse of the communist regime in June 1989. Many representatives of the generation ahead point to the announcement of martial law on December 13, 1981 as a turning point in their lives. Polish philosopher and editor of the volume Wojna Pokoleń, The Generation War, Piotr Nowak, reminiscences. In the discussion which initiated our book, we pondered the question of what constituted our generation and unanimously arrived at the conclusion that it was martial law. However, not as a single event, as a sudden clash, but as an event stretched over the entire hopeless 1980s. Like the year 1968 forced Poles now in their 60s, we were formed by the protracted, crawling martial law and its aftermath, and this is obvious. In his interview with Beata Tabla, the Polish journalist Tomasz Sikielski says, "Martial law is the moment when politics invaded our childhood. It did it by depriving us of the anticipated children's program, Teleranek. This is our main common memory." Polish writer Krzysztof Varga echoes this statement by claiming his belonging to the generation without Sunday children's program, Generacja bez Teleranka. Exactly then, remembers the author of his novel Aleja Niepodległości, Independence Avenue, on that wintry, frosty Sunday his childhood ended. Agata Bielik-Rowson realizes, not without sadness, that martial law swept away with just one move the whole pretended prosperity. Poor, badly dressed, longing for an orange, we had to say goodbye not only to our small stabilization, but also to our childhood. Post-1989 Polish public discourse has demonstrated considerable creativity in inventing a suitable name for the last communist generation, a name that reflects its formative trauma. It has been called Generation 89 on the model of the older generations of 56 and 68 and the younger 2000 generation. The martial law generation, the John Paul II generation, the transitional generation, the generation astride, the differently lost generation, and the bonsai generation, the placed in the saddle generation, the late Gomulka generation, the June elections generation, the King's Beer generation, Generation O, Generacja Wszystko, and Generation No Logo. Krzysztof Varga, born in 1966, sees in this feverish coinage of labels a desperate desire to substantiate something that doesn't exist. For him, the last legitimate Polish generation were the Columbuses, Kolumbowie, born in the 1920s, whose adolescence coincided with World War II, and whose generational self-awareness was shaped by their participation in the tragic Warsaw Uprising in 1944. Varga questions the legitimacy of the subsequent Polish generations created by the public media because those generations lacked the experience of a genuine collective trauma. He points out that behind this constant creation of new generations, there is unspoken, maybe even unconscious, but real nostalgia for trauma, a longing for a life-defining, full-fledged, catastrophic event. Varga's skepticism is shared by a number of distinguished members of his generation. Cultural philosopher Agata Bieli-Kropsen describes her own generation as a lost generation that could not locate itself in history, bezdomni w historii. Olga Tokarczuk, born in 1962, one of the most popular contemporary Polish writers, claims in an interview for the weekly Politica, "It seems to me that my generation achieved maturity when everything important for the country and for the nation had already taken place. We found ourselves a little bit off history." Literary critic Paweł Dunin-Wąsowicz also describes his age group as bystanders and spectators of the historical process. Of course, the introduction of martial law was a very important event, but we perceived it as immature individuals who were underage and dependent, and in this sense functioning outside the society. What united us was our total passivity. The pattern taking shape in such self-reflections is quite transparent. The demographic cohort, whose initiation into adulthood coincided with the prolonged collapse of communism and the transition to liberal democracy, denies itself generational status due to the non-revolutionary, non-violent character of the 1989 events and its bloodless participation in them. In the definitions of the concept of generation quoted earlier, there was no indication that the generation-defining event must necessarily involve armed resistance and human casualties. This is rather a cultural stereotype very deeply rooted in the Polish collective consciousness, towards which the last communist generation is evidently feeling ambiguous. In fact, the careful reading of these generational self-reflections reveals that self-denigration is a common trope for asserting Generation 89's uniqueness with regard to prior heroic and self-sacrificial Polish generations now comfortably located in the historical process. Agata Bieli-Kropsen explains, "Although I claim that we failed as a generation in comparison to the successful '68 generation, I simultaneously believe that our strength is in our failure. Perhaps our muteness stems from the fact that we have made the wrong assumption, the assumption that we as a generation must have our own unified and distinct voice, like all other generations before us. With this assumption, we have no other choice but to admit our failure. But if we reject that assumption, it will turn out, that's right, I don't know what. We evidently need more time to process our experience. For the time being, our only authentic characteristic is our perversity. We have always wanted to be different." Much of the last communist generation's resistance to generational classifications and identifications stems from its disinterest in collectivist projects of any kind, and from its disengagement from the traditional heroic narrative. Its cynicism, points out Bieli-Kropsen, reflects its complete lack of mythological sensitivity. By lack of mythological sensitivity, the Polish cultural philosopher means lack of reverence for the Polish romantic messianic mythology, not indifference to mythopoesis in general. Despite its tendency to describe itself in negative terms as a failure of traditionally established heroico-martyrological generational paradigms, the last communist generation is determined to assert its place in Polish history and is quite explicit in its myth-making intentions. As Olga Tokarczuk has speculated, because my generation doesn't have history, it will try to create it. Krzysztof Varga's last novel, Aleja Niepodległości, Independence Avenue, which came out in March 2010, was unanimously labeled by the Polish literary critics as an explicit generational myth. It depicts the post-collapse lives of two friends and classmates from the Warsaw St. Augustine Catholic High School, supplemented by occasional flashbacks to their childhood and adolescence in the 1970s and the 1980s. Cristian Apostata and Jakub Fidelis, as their last names articulately suggest, are intellectual constructs that embody the author's critical views on the generational debate in Polish media. The apostate and the faithful one, who grew up in the same neighborhood and went to the same schools in the People's Republic of Poland, could not choose to lead more different lifestyles in democratic Poland. The former gradually defects from his career as a conceptual artist and becomes an outsider, addicted to alcohol and masturbation. The latter remains stubbornly faithful to his career as a dance performer and a TV celebrity, by constantly reinventing himself physically and artistically to stay on top of show business. By creating these two diametrically different characters, Varga convincingly illustrates his opinion previously stated in the Polish press that what really matters is the individual experience in a single person, not the age group, and that one might feel less connected to his peers than to people from other generations with whom he or she shares a similar worldview and sensitivity. However, like Mary Shelley's emblematic character, Varga's two Frankensteins turn against their creator's intentions as soon as he not only attempts to, but successfully kills them. Although Cristian Apostata vanishes in an airplane crash on the first page of the novel, and Jakub Fidelis dies in a car accident on the last, their deaths happen simultaneously in time. The premature and non-heroic deaths of the former classmates ironically equalize and unify them by marking their defeat in the struggle to find a place for themselves in Polish post-communist reality. A closer look at their different lifestyles shows that they do have something in common after all, and that is ontological confusion. Both Christian and Jakub seem to be locked in their adolescent worlds. The former dreams of making a name as a conceptual artist, to differentiate himself from his communist father and his fascination with classical art, while the latter longs to immortalize his name as a national hero. Soon after the political change, Christian realizes that the inadequacy of his art in New Poland, dominated by fierce competition, consumerism, and mass culture, and therefore retreats to self-destructive addictions. Unlike his friend, Jakub doesn't give up his dream of fame easily. He makes a dazzling career in show business, which meets all contemporary standards of success, but for Jakub, success is not complete if it doesn't have a patriotic meaning. However, all of his attempts to ascribe national significance to his rumbas and foxtrots only produce comic effects and illuminate his mental unfitness for the world of mass culture. By rendering his 40-year-old characters caricatures of their younger selves, Varga captures the drama of the last communist generation, which finds it difficult, if not impossible, to find a modus vivendi in the post-1989 reality. The Polish avant-garde writer Witold Gombrowicz predicted this outcome. Even if communism went away, it would leave them being something else than they were before. They would be left alone, but different, shaken to their core, filled up with a reality for which they don't have a name. The authors of the post-1989 initiation novels assume as their generational mission finding a name for the People's Republic of Poland and deciphering the imprint it has left on their psyche. There is a growing realization among the Polish writing community that it was naive to believe that the fall of communism would create a radically different cultural reality and would introduce a completely new set of values. The truth is that the Velvet Divorce created favorable circumstances for the perpetuation of the phantom-like communist culture. Part of the reason lies in its mimicry and instinct for survival. In order to gain legitimacy, it constantly enriched itself with carefully distilled values of traditional folklore and Catholic culture, of the Romantic code, of mass culture imported from the West. The hope of the young Polish writers today is that they're making sense of this amalgam will clear the way for new cultural projects and systems of values. Now, going back to Vargas' Aleja Niepodległości, it might contain the most explicit rendering of the generational myth, but it is not a pioneer in this endeavor, as Dariusz Nowacki asserts in his review for Gazeta Wyborcza. Many initiation novels published between 1989 and 2011 have attempted to capture the uniqueness of Generation 89 and establish its rightful place in the succession of Polish generations, only in a less overt fashion. And a representative sample of those novels include Izabela Filipiak's Absolute Amnesia, Grażyna Plebanek's The Girls from Portofino, Tomek Trizna's Miss Nobody, Ewa Madejska's Katoniela. I'm not going to read the whole list. All of these novels are set in the 1970s and the 1980s and depict their protagonists growing up and coming of age under communism. Their actions take place almost exclusively in a domestic setting and focus primarily on the parent-child relationship, thus confirming Bielik's observation that our generational drama has all the characteristics of what Freud defines as a family romance. It doesn't take place on the big stage of history, but involves the basic constituents of one's self-identity, or rather the lack of thereof, home, roots, and parents. In his review of Joanna Butter's novel Piaskowa Góra, Sandy Hill, Przemysław Czepliński writes that the work could be read as a tale about the demise of the communist society, but also as a family saga. And this definition applies to the majority of the novels in my study. Where does the Polish family come from? Asks the literary critic and responds, from the non-reflective inheritance of the model we were raised by, and also from the failure to recognize the need to create a new model. We know that the traditional model is a source of unhappiness, that it is a prison for women and a dream pasture for men, that it doesn't ensure good upbringing and doesn't cultivate independence, it rather deprives of self-worth, that it is based on the economic domination of the man of the house, which women compensate by assuming the role of gastronomic mothers. In his fascinating study of the public and private life of the Polish youth in the People's Republic of Poland, Krzysztof Kuszyński notes that the Polish family began to lose its significance as an educational institution in the second half of the 1960s. The familial crisis manifested itself in three major pathological developments: growing alienation between parents and children, rising parental alcoholism and divorce rates, and an epidemic feeling of abandonment and loneliness among the youth. The post-1989 initiation novels attest to the validity of Kuszyński's findings by portraying Polish socialist families as loosely connected units of emasculated men, overburdened women, and lonely children, each independently seeking a refuge from hostile reality. The fictionalized childhood narratives candidly disclose dark family secrets, embarrassing habits, compromising intimate thoughts, which give the individual works a flavor of sensationalism. The striking similarity of individual experiences across the novels, however, alludes to the prevalence of deviant behavioral patterns and modes of thought and leads to the realization of the widespread moral degeneracy. The 1970s and the 1980s were a particularly difficult time for parenting. The political instability and economic hardships deepened the adults' distrust in the government, but no one dared believe yet that communism could fall. Despite their frustration with humiliating living conditions and their inner protest against confining communist ideology, parents blindly reinforced socially sanctioned values and behavioral models in their children's upbringing, believing that they were thus preparing them to survive communist reality, or simply exteriorizing their panic and fear of a political cataclysm. Bieli Kropson identifies this gap between parental beliefs and rearing strategies as the core of the intergenerational conflict. Today, I think that it would have been better for all of us if our parents would have admitted that the parental role overwhelmed them and wouldn't have pretended that everything was all right just to bring us up. Pervading the quasi-autobiographical accounts of the last communist generation is the sad realization that their parents failed not only as caregivers, but also as role models. The lack of positive authority figures in the young protagonists' lives jeopardized their transition into healthy and stable adulthood, as they refused to emulate the flawed paternal, masculine, and maternal, feminine models and perpetuate their damaging effects. And I was trying to find a link between the deviant maturation process of the characters in the novels and the genre of the books, and I arrived at this conclusion. I argue in my book that the Polish post-1989 accounts of communist childhoods represent a specific subgenre of the initiation novel, the so-called liminal novel. Unlike the classical Bildungsroman, which is an affirmative genre, confident in the validity of the society it depicts and anxious to lead both hero and reader toward a productive place within the world, the liminal novel depicts rites of passage that become suspended in the middle stage. The suspension results either from the protagonist's conscious desire to remain forever in the blissful state of social invisibility so that they don't have to deal with intimidating adult issues, or from their inability to complete the transition into adulthood under the present circumstances. To account for the different outcomes of young protagonists' developmental arrest, I adopt Spariosu's distinction between margin and limen. He defines the relationship between margin and center is the actual world of institutional power, as supportive corrective, and between limen and center as subversive. In other words, according to Spariosu, marginality in literature has the potential to redefine the center, while liminality transcends it by providing access to and by initiating new worlds. And going back to the young protagonists in the novels, for some of them, the liminal realm of their suspended transition into adulthood becomes a margin, a dead end. They emerge from their prematurely aborted quest for self-identity, fragmented, incomplete, and ontologically disoriented, only to end their lives tragically. Their death, however, doesn't redefine the center, it destroys it. In this sense, the post-1989 Polish initiation novel's representation of marginality is closer to Paris Fermat's understanding of it as a centrifugal force that ultimately invades and destroys the center, annihilating itself in the process, than to Spariosu's supportive corrective definition. For the majority of the protagonists in our novels, however, the liminal situation becomes a terrain for negotiating new identities, both personal and communal, and for initiating alternative social arrangements. And I would like to mention that there is a clear gender distinction in the behavior of the characters in the liminal space or during their transition into adulthood. Male characters and male writers are more inclined to view themselves as victims and to destroy the center by martyring themselves, while female characters and female writers are determined to gain back their sense of agency, to discover who they are in the new reality, and to negotiate new cultural projects. Thank you for your attention.